The fifth chapter in Brene Brown's book, Daring Greatly, is called Minding the Gap. And she doesn't mean the gap between the train in the London tube stations and the platform and the train itself, or even on the Red Line, though that would be cooler if that's what she meant. Rather, she is calling us to mind the gap that exists in the relationship between our aspirations and our lived culture. You might find the word culture there surprising, odd, right on point, or just a little amorphous. What is it truly to have a culture anyway? As organizational development pioneers Terence Deal and Alan Kennedy explained, culture is the way we do things around here. In short, culture is less about what we want to achieve and more about who we are. If you were wondering, organizational leaders have learned that culture trumps strategy almost every day. You might wonder why this topic isn't a book about shame and vulnerability. I did. Brown posits that in too many places in our society, there's a gap between our stated values and aspirations and our culture, the way we do things around here. Though there's nothing wrong with being aspirational, in fact, it is essential, if we do not mind the gap, then we too often miss or give a pass to instances when we fail to act in a way that embody our aspirations. I will be honest, failing to embody your aspirations to me sounds pretty human, and I hope you think so too. But, when we who are leaders and shapers of our community, and by that I mean every single one of us, regularly don't mind the gap, then too often our actions belie our actual values. When we don't function in ways that are transparently value-directed, some people, real people, who are or ought to be important to us, can become hurt and disillusioned. In short, in a covenantal faith, when we fail to keep our promises and don't take the needed steps back into right relationship, the result is a lack of trust and often disengagement. We lose each other. We lose relationship. We lose, in fact, that interdependent reality that we proclaim to be at the very heart of this truly wondrous faith. Since transparency, openness, and vulnerability, as uncomfortable as they can be, are the way back into relationship when there's a breach, I'm going to share with you some specifics of a mind the gap conflict that occurred nearly 3 years ago within our National Unitarian Universalist Association. It is commonly referred to as the UUA hiring crisis. Before I proceed, though, I want to acknowledge to the people of color in the room, the women, and those with other often undervalued lives, that any time we tell stories of oppression, we can experience harm. Please know that we care about these patterns in your life and are here to listen. I shared this story of this crisis today because the leaders of color within our faith movement specifically wanted sunlight on this aspect of Unitarian Universalist culture. By sharing this today, I want to call this congregation to minding the gap. And this practice of paying attention to the space between our aspirations and our lived culture is an important spiritual practice for each and every one of us. So in a nutshell, here's what happened. In early March 2017, the UUA's Director of Congregational Life, the Reverend Scott Taylor, hired Reverend Andy Burnett, senior minister of the Valley UU congregation in Chandler, Arizona, and then a UUA board of trustee, who is a white man, to replace the retiring leader of the southern region of the UUA, who is also white. So a white man would have replaced a white man in a pretty senior management position. News of Burnett's hiring and his resignation from the UUA Board of Trustees emerged as religious professionals of color were gathered for their annual Finding Our Way Home retreat. One of these religious professionals, Christina Rivera, Director of Administration and Finance at the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Church in Charlottesville, Virginia, and also a UUA trustee who is a Chicana Latina, told colleagues at the retreat and our national publication, the UU World, that she had been a finalist for the job, but had been told that she was not the right fit for the team. Over the next week, charges spread on social media that the UUA had hired another white person over an unidentified woman of color who was a qualified finalist for the Southern Region job. Critics pointed out that the 5 regional leads who supervised 50 members of the UUA's congregational life staff throughout our country were all white ministers, as is Taylor, their supervisor. Only 2 of Taylor's 10 colleagues on the UUA's Leadership Council were people of color, including at that time the president and the person who headed up our diversity initiatives. In short, there was public outcry from hundreds of religious professionals, white and of color, clergy and laity, that UUA hiring practices favored white ministers over other job applicants, especially for senior positions. These complaints, and some painful and defensive and just totally not sensitive to that moment comments by President Morales, led to his resignation, the resignation of Chief Operating Officer Harlan Limpert and Reverend Scott Taylor. These were followed by the resignation, also due to backlash, of Don Southworth, the executive director of the UU Ministers Association. In short, Unitarian Universalists of all identities, but particularly those who identified as a person of color, queer, trans, or true gender, as a woman, disabled, or otherwise simply otherwise as a non-white, able-bodied straight male, began to call out that Unitarian Universalism had a powerful saving theology and had a culture that centralized and prioritized white experiences. In short, when attention was called to the gap revealed that culture won over aspirations, and a white supremacist culture at that. I will say there's a lot of information to sort through and a lot of different perspectives, and it can be hard. I've seen from people's posts on Facebook and my own need to research and discern to understand how this conclusion was reached about these events. This was 3 years ago. Why am I preaching on this today? It's because I think Brene Brown, in her book, Daring Greatly, offers questions that I think can help us examine this crisis in ways that reveal how we did not live up to our values and why many fairly describe our unspoken culture as one that prioritizes white experiences over people of color. So she offers a series of questions, of which she writes, I think the power of these questions is their ability to shed light on the darkest areas of our lives: disconnection, disengagement, and our struggle for worthiness. Today, they are our means of holding up our aspirational values against our practice culture. For many of the answers, I've relied on a 2018 report from the UUA's Commission on Institutional Change, a group of people who did tremendous work. I hope that they could help us get unstuck. Question: what rules and expectations are followed, enforced, and ignored? This question is at the heart of the matter. Religious professionals of color were more likely to see their accountability to a stated mission, specifically to fostering with urgency a diverse, anti-oppressive Unitarian Universalism, whereas white UUs tended to perceive that mission as an incremental process, and one in which there was a responsibility for caring for those in our predominantly white current Unitarian Universalist community. Until this hiring crisis, there seemed to be little consequence for a lack of commitment to promoting a Unitarian Universalism which could come closer to meeting the mandates of our principles. Similarly, there seemed to be a lack of willingness to reach out and retain the many people of color and younger activists who could find a home in our Unitarian Universalist tradition. Question: do people feel safe and supported talking about how they feel and asking for what they need? In this instance, what it revealed is that people of color didn't. One reason for this is because they were shamed for not being competent or experienced enough, even in a system that rarely hires people of color for upper management positions. For example, when one director of religious education asked President Peter Morales why all 5 regional leaders of the UUA are white, his answer referred to the need for a larger pool of qualified applicants of color so that people could be placed into positions where they could succeed. In the audience listening to him was Cristina Rivera, who would shortly learn that she didn't get such a position, even though the head hunter said, quote, "You could step in and do the job tomorrow," unquote. Not only was there a sense of being blamed and shamed, it just didn't seem honest. After discernment with her family, Riviera decided to go public in naming herself as the person of color who did not get the regional job. She told the UU world, "I'm really, really glad the story is out there. From the perspective of institutional racism, that's so important. But it's equally important to say a real person was injured, and it's easy to overlook that." Question: what happens when someone fails, disappoints, or makes a mistake? It got really bad. I mean, really ugly, ugly bad. Without a clear and accountable process for resolving these issues, events and individuals were tried in the court of social media, not the greatest court, which resulted in confusion, targeting, and vilification of individuals, and did not promote a greater understanding of what had gone wrong. On March 19th, for example, Leslie Mack, a member of the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism organizing collective, wrote, "Just when I think the UU faith has made some strides, I feel the pull of white supremacy in the faith snap at the back of my neck. It feels like whiplash. It is physical. It is spiritual. It is painful. And those in power should be ashamed at themselves for perpetuating and cultivating anti-Blackness as the default setting in the UUA." Further, the resignations of Peter Morales and Taylor, combined with the rumors and divisions on social media, led to their almost complete isolation from the Unitarian Universalist community. Question: how prevalent are shame and blame, and how are they showing up? The answer to that is prevalent. The lack of support for truth-telling has meant that religious professionals of color are carrying an unsustainable amount of tension, especially because they too often work in congregational systems ill-equipped to affirm people of color in leadership positions. In the months after this hiring crisis, 15 religious professionals were either pushed out or fired from their jobs, often for raising concerns. Christina Rivera literally continues to get death threats. One of them was within the last 6 months. These attacks even come from within the congregation that she has served for years, though only after she spoke out. Her children have also been targeted as fair game for comment. The white man awarded the regional position, Andy Burnett, was also mocked and objectified, including having his picture featured with the label white supremacist, which resulted in unnecessary ostracization. He actually wasn't even invited to board social events because they just felt a need to push him away. Someone else wrote, quote, "Victimhood doesn't look good on you," unquote, on his Facebook page, and his family, including his children, suffered from him becoming the perceived symbol of white supremacy culture. Question: what behaviors are rewarded, punished? Where were money and resources applied? The 3 senior white UUA leaders negotiated severance agreements that in total were about $500,000 and far exceeded the guidelines for such agreements. In contrast, no consistent resources were available for religious professionals of color or others who experienced traumatic stress as a result of the lack of clarity of mission around racial inclusion and the gap between our aspirations and our lived reality. Question: what is the collective tolerance for discomfort? Is the discomfort of learning, trying new things, and giving and receiving feedback normalized? Or is there a high premium put on comfort? And how does that look? Quote, "Keeping the congregation from getting upset has been used as a tactic when a small group of congregants want to remove a minister or religious professional, white but also particularly of color, from their position without congregational transparency or the open recognition of the microaggressions directed towards that targeted employee. The perceived need to keep these harming behaviors secret compounded the trauma." This is just wrong, but it's also misguided. If properly supported, the hiring of a religious professional of color can be a turning point in a congregation's commitment to address bias and racism inherent in a white-centered system. Aisha Hauser, a religious educator, observed, quote, "I feel like we are at a precipice. Either we are going to be who we say we are, or we're going to be a country club for white people," unquote. The question is, will we learn through this period of collective discomfort? So, this is my question. How can we turn this around, and how can we mine this gap? According to Brene Brown, we can mine the gap by showing honesty and integrity instead of rationalizing and letting things slide. So for instance, when Peter Morales resigned, the UUA board appointed 3 co-presidents who were all Black, and which included a former UUA president, Bill Sinkford. When these co-presidents learned about the excessive severance packages and the secrecy around those agreements, they went public with their findings in general. They also renegotiated those packages in a fairer way. We can mine the gap by functioning with respect and accountability, even if this is messy. We fail to do this when fast and easy is more important than our process. In regards to hiring processes, accountability could look like leaving positions open unless qualified candidates of color are part of the applicant pool. Respect could look like acknowledging that many religious professionals of color can bring healthy connections to diverse groups in the community, and through their own life experiences, offer the congregation fresh perspectives and methods. We can mind the gap by working with gratitude and respect, which includes setting limits. Brene Brown says that when rebelling and being cool are important, then we have failed to set important limits. In order to realize the connection, humility, and commitment that becoming an anti-racist denomination demands, we must make clear that shaming behaviors are not productive. This can be as simple as not affirming those who do attempt to shame, or as powerful as calling those people back into right relationship. We can mind the gap by making space for emotional connection and by honoring feelings. Minding the gap requires both an embrace of our own vulnerability and cultivation of shame resilience. We are going to be called upon to show up in new and uncomfortable ways. We may have to process some feelings along the way. Good. Let us just not sedate our conscience as we utilize empathy and build compassion and connection. At the National General Assembly, right after this hiring crisis, the newly elected president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, Susan Frederick Gray, put out a message of care and support. She said, "Throughout the General Assembly, we reflected on the narratives and wider systems of oppression that perpetuate both systematic and personal violence. This week, those reflections became personal and proximate. As I have listened to Unitarian Universalists reflect, I've been moved by the connections made to Bryan Stevenson's powerful message to us at this General Assembly that, quote, simply punishing the broken, walking away from them or hiding them from sight only ensures that they remain broken, and we do too. There is no wholeness outside of our reciprocal humanity." If there's a message I want you to take away from today, it's this: there is no wholeness outside our reciprocal humanity. Dear ones, in the message of Brene Brown, minding the gap is a daring strategy. We have to pay attention to the space between where we are actually standing and where we want to be. More importantly, we have to practice the aspirational values in our culture. Minding the gap requires us to embrace our vulnerability and cultivate shame resilience. We are going to be called upon as leaders and congregants and just people in new and uncomfortable ways. We don't have to be perfect, just engaged and committed to aligning values with action. To invite you into this work, I leave you with a question. What does minding the gap and daring greatly look like at All Souls? What does minding the gap and daring greatly look like at All Souls? May we continue to ask and answer that question within our covenantal community. Amen.